In March 1903, a professional survey team was sent into the southern Algerian Sahara. The mission was led by Etienne Machon. Machon was not a seeker of legends or myths. He was a high-precision engineer and a graduate of the École Polytechnique. His reputation was built on hard data and mathematical accuracy. The French colonial office gave him a clear task: map a vast region of the desert that was officially recorded as empty sand. The expedition was planned to last exactly 6 weeks. The team did not return on schedule. They remained in the desert for 11 weeks. When they eventually crossed back into known territory, the condition of the survivors was dire. 2 of the surveyors were dead. The survivors did not give immediate details to the local authorities. Within months of their return, the team's lead photographer, Henri Vasseur, was committed to a sanitarium. He remained in that institution until his death. Despite the loss of his men, Machon completed his work. He filed a massive 340-page report with the colonial administration. It included geological charts, site measurements, and photographic plates. The government initially printed a limited run of 200 copies for official use. Then, the policy changed abruptly. Within a year, authorities were sent to every public library and archive in France. Their job was to locate and seize every single copy of the Machon report. They were systematically collected and destroyed. The official reason for the recall was that the report contained technical errors, but the scale of the suppression suggested a different motive. Machon was an elite engineer. He did not make 340 pages of simple mistakes. He had found something in the sand that was a biological impossibility. It was a discovery that challenged the official history of the world. He had documented evidence of something that was not supposed to exist in the desert. The data he brought back suggested that the timeline of human civilization was not what we were taught. For the first 3 weeks of the expedition, Machon and his team maintained a rigid schedule. They moved 10 miles a day through the southern dunes. Their journals from this period show a routine of recording temperatures, wind speeds, and barometric pressure. There was no indication of anything unusual in the landscape. The team was focused on the primary objective: creating a high-precision map of a territory the French government considered a blank space on the map. On the morning of April 19, 1903, the direction of the mission changed. The team's lead Tuareg guide insisted on showing Machon a specific sector of the desert. He referred to it by a name that translated to the place of the giants who fell. As a graduate of the École Polytechnique, Machon was not interested in folklore. He viewed the desert through the lens of geometry and physics. However, he followed the guide to see if the area contained any mineral deposits or landmarks that would justify the expedition's high cost. When they arrived at the coordinates, the team stopped. They were looking at a series of massive, horizontal ridges that stretched across the sand for miles. The ridges were perfectly parallel to one another. At first glance, Machon assumed they were unusual geological outcroppings, sedimentary rock pushed to the surface by tectonic activity or shaped by millions of years of wind erosion. Machon spent the next 4 days performing a high-precision survey. He divided his team into 2 groups. Each group was tasked with measuring the length and width of the formations using independent triangulation methods. He wanted to eliminate any possibility of human error or optical illusions caused by the heat. He used steel chains and transit levels to map the elevations of the ridges. The data from both teams matched perfectly. As they moved 4,000 meters into the center of the formation, Machon noticed a change in the material. The surface of the ridges began to show a repeating pattern. It was not the random grain of sandstone or the smooth surface of granite. It was the fibrous, interlocking structure of organic wood. Machon used a pickaxe to clear the surface sand from one of the ridges. Underneath the dust, he found a layer of petrified bark. These were not pillars of stone. They were tree trunks. The discovery was impossible according to the botanical records of the era. The ridges were not small. Machon measured the average width of these trunks and found they were significantly larger than the largest known trees in North America. The most disturbing aspect was the organization. The trunks were not scattered like a forest that had died naturally. They were laid out in a grid. Each trunk was oriented on the same axis, lying perfectly flat against the desert floor. It looked like an industrial storage yard on a planetary scale. Machon mapped the extent of the site and realized the field of trunks continued far beyond the horizon. His final calculations for the total area of the site reached 30,000 square kilometers. This made the field as large as the entire nation of Belgium. Machon's notes became focused on the logistics of the site. He tried to understand how such a vast quantity of wood could exist in a region that had been a desert for thousands of years. He documented 47 individual specimens in the first week alone. Each one was a single, continuous trunk of petrified matter. There were no branches, no leaves, and no roots, just the massive, uniform bodies of trees that were too large to exist. The team geologist, Paul Renard, examined the mineral composition. He confirmed the trunks were fully petrified. The organic carbon had been replaced by silica. This process takes millions of years in standard geological models. Yet the trunks sat on top of the sand, not beneath it. They looked as if they had been placed there deliberately, despite being turned to solid stone. The ridges were spaced exactly 60 meters apart. This consistency convinced Machon that he was not looking at a natural phenomenon, but at an engineered site. Machon catalogued 47 individual specimens in this single sector of the survey. He recorded the dimensions of each one with the precision of a civil engineer. The largest specimen he measured was 42 meters in diameter, that is 138 feet across. To understand the scale, the Arc de Triomphe in Paris is only 45 meters high. This single tree trunk was nearly as wide as that monument is tall. The largest living organism currently recognized by science is the General Sherman tree in California. It has a base diameter of about 11 meters. The objects Machon measured were nearly 4 times that size. There is no biological framework in modern science that allows for a tree of these dimensions to exist. The structural strength required to support the weight of such a tree would exceed the limits of wood fiber in our current atmospheric conditions. The material had petrified into a dense, glass-like mineral. When Machon's team chipped away at the surface, they found the internal structure was perfectly preserved. The cross-sections revealed growth rings of incredible thickness. Some rings were nearly a meter wide. In modern trees, growth rings are typically measured in millimeters. These rings indicated that the trees grew in an environment with an atmospheric composition entirely different from our own. It pointed to a period of history where the air was denser and more oxygen-rich. But the physical size was not the most significant discovery. It was the alignment. The trunks did not lie where they had grown. They were arranged in parallel rows, spaced with mathematical regularity. They were not scattered like a forest leveled by a natural disaster. They were stacked. Machon found clusters where 3 massive trunks were placed side by side on a leveled section of the desert floor. To move a single trunk of this size would be a task beyond any engineering capacity of the early 20th century. Even before the wood turned to stone, a 42-meter-wide trunk would have weighed hundreds of thousands of tons. To harvest, transport, and stack these specimens in a deliberate pattern indicates a massive industrial operation. Machon was looking at a resource that had been processed and stored. It was a logistical site of a scale that modern history does not acknowledge. The surveyor noted that there were no stumps nearby. There were no root systems in the immediate area. The trees had been brought to this location from a distant source. The force required to move a single one of these objects would leave permanent scars in the landscape, yet the trunks sat directly on top of the ancient desert floor. This suggested that the ground itself had been engineered to support the weight. Machon spent days looking for tool marks, but the petrification was total. The evidence was frozen in stone, showing a level of technology that contradicts the official timeline of human development. The data Machon collected in the Sahara acts as a primary piece of evidence for the Tartarian world grid theory. This framework suggests that the global landscape was once part of a highly advanced, unified infrastructure. According to this theory, the Sahara Desert was not merely a green savanna 6,000 years ago. It served as a managed industrial forest and a logistical hub for a global civilization. The trees Machon documented were the primary resource for this civilization's massive construction projects. If Machon's measurements are accurate, the current botanical record used by modern science is a fabrication. Mainstream biology claims that trees have strict physical limits due to gravity and water transport. However, the 42-meter-wide trunks prove those limits were once vastly different. These giant specimens match the world tree descriptions found in suppressed manuscripts from the 17th century. These documents were removed from the public record because they described a planet with a much denser atmosphere and a biological capacity that exceeds our own. They spoke of forests so large they provided the structural foundations for the entire Old World. These giant trees were the essential material used to build the megalithic structures found on every continent. Mainstream historians claim that structures like the Great Pyramids, the massive cathedrals of Europe, and the star forts of the Americas were built with primitive copper tools and simple wooden rollers. This explanation is technically impossible. Moving stone blocks weighing hundreds of tons requires leverage and structural support that ordinary timber cannot provide. The trunks Machon found in the desert would have been the industrial-grade material needed for such engineering feats. They were not just plants, they were the structural components of a global empire. This civilization possessed the technology to move hundreds of thousands of tons of biological material across the African continent. The grid-like arrangement of the trunks suggests they were harvested and stored in a central location. This was an industrial extraction operation. The trees were used to create the heavy machinery and the lifting platforms required for megalithic architecture. The existence of these trees contradicts the official timeline of human progress. It proves that a previous civilization had an engineering capacity that dwarfs our current technology. These were the raw materials of the Old World. By classifying these remains as natural rock formations or suppressing reports like Machon's, the official record hides the fact that our ancestors had access to resources and technology that were erased from history. The Sahara site was not a forest, it was a storage yard for the largest construction material ever known to man. Following the return of the Machon expedition, the colonial administration did not organize a scientific symposium to discuss the findings. Instead, they organized a demolition. In 1907, a follow-up team was sent back to the specific coordinates of the grid. This was not a mapping team. It was a military-industrial unit equipped with heavy drilling equipment and large quantities of industrial explosives. Their mission was documented under the vague term land clearing for potential infrastructure. The objective was to neutralize the largest specimens documented in Machon's survey. They focused on the trunks that exceeded 30 meters in diameter. The reports from this 1907 mission indicate that the petrified wood was so dense it destroyed multiple steel drill bits. It required multiple blasting cycles to break the trunks into smaller fragments that could then be buried by the shifting dunes. By 1908, the visual landmarks of the 42-meter specimen had been completely leveled. For decades, the remaining proof of the survey lived in the secure colonial archives in Paris. The 1903 report existed in its rare, restricted run, and the original glass photographic plates were stored in a climate-controlled room. Then, in 1962, a fire broke out at the Bibliothèque de l'Institut Géographique. The fire was highly selective. It did not consume the entire building or even the entire floor. The damage was contained entirely within the colonial-era archive room. Every map and every photographic plate from Machon's 1903 expedition was destroyed in that single event. Other sections of the library, containing significantly older and more flammable materials, were left untouched. The fire occurred precisely as independent researchers were beginning to ask for access to the colonial records regarding Sahara mineralogy. This was the moment the official record of the giant trees was effectively erased from the public domain. Modern attempts to recover the truth have met with a consistent pattern of career destruction and physical harm. In 1987, an independent geologist named Lucien Paty used fragmented notes from Machon's surviving personal letters to attempt to relocate the site. He managed to locate what he believed was one of the smaller remaining trunks, a specimen 12 meters wide that had been overlooked by the 1907 demolition team. He took detailed photographs and collected mineral samples. Upon his return to Europe, the reaction from the academic community was immediate. Within 6 months, he was stripped of his university position and his research funding was permanently terminated. His colleagues were advised not to collaborate with him on any future projects. In 1989, Paty's home was burglarized. The intruders did not take high-value electronics or cash. They targeted his safe, which contained his field notes and his original camera film. Every piece of evidence from his 1987 trip was removed. Paty died in 1994 of a sudden cardiac event. He was 51 years old and had no history of heart disease or health issues. A similar fate met an American researcher in 1994 who attempted to use satellite thermography to find heat signatures of the buried trunks. His data was seized under national security protocols and his research was classified. He also suffered a fatal health complication within 2 years of his discovery. The official explanation for the Machon report remains that the surveyor was simply incompetent. The administration claims he mistook natural sedimentary rock ridges for trees and that his mathematical triangulation was fundamentally flawed. This explanation ignores the basic facts of Machon's professional background. He was an elite engineer trained at the highest levels of the state. He spent a decade mapping territories without a single recorded error. Furthermore, the measurement error theory does not explain the government's response. If a surveyor makes a mistake, the standard procedure is to publish a correction or use the error as a case study for future students. Governments do not use industrial explosives and systematic archival destruction to cover up a mistake. The destruction of the records is the ultimate evidence that the records were accurate. It proves that the government knew these trees were real and that their existence made the official timeline of human history impossible to maintain. They burned the evidence because the evidence proved that a global industrial civilization existed long before our own, and that this civilization operated on a scale that our current technology cannot match. Modern education teaches that the desert is a void of dead sand. This narrative is used to hide the remnants of a world that was removed from the historical record. The desert serves as a physical covering for the ruins of a much older civilization. The current population lives on top of these ruins without understanding the scale of the structures buried beneath them. The information found in the Machon report represents chapters of history that were removed from the official textbooks. The suppression of this data was necessary to maintain the belief in linear human progress. If the public acknowledged that giant trees were once harvested and stacked in the Sahara, the entire foundation of modern biology and history would be destroyed. It would prove that a previous civilization had engineering and transport capabilities that match or exceed our own. The fire that destroyed the photographic plates and the removal of the reports were deliberate actions to prevent this realization. The sand in the Sahara is constantly shifting, and the efforts to keep this information hidden are failing. Independent research and modern technology are making it possible to see the evidence that was supposed to be neutralized. The official history of the world is incomplete and does not account for the massive industrial remains found in the desert. The giant petrified trunks prove that the Earth's atmosphere and its resources were once entirely different. This evidence is still in the ground, waiting for further discovery. The scale of the artifacts in the Algerian desert proves that history is not what is taught in schools. It is necessary to look at the scale of the world and recognize the patterns that the official record refuses to explain. The data remains waiting under the sand.